Hello, I'm Adam Hart-Davis and this is how Britain was built. I'm about to visit a maritime powerhouse, a city that's exported products, people and pop music all around the world.
Liverpool, one of the world's most important ports. 9 million people sailed to the New World from here. It played a vital role in building the British Empire, handling more than a quarter of all imperial imports and exports. For 150 years, practically all the world's cotton passed through these docks. But it was also at the centre of a more sinister trade. More than 90% of Britain's slave ships sailed from here. But abolition didn't stop the city's growth. It grew richer still, and the wealth created by its port paid for its great buildings and its engineering achievements. The world's longest road tunnel, the first skyscraper, iconic cathedrals, and an instantly recognisable shoreline dominated by the Albert Dock, once the powerhouse of Liverpool's trade. And in the middle of the 20th century, Liverpool began to export something very different.
More number one hit singles have come out of Liverpool than out of any other city in the world.
Pop culture is as much a part of Liverpool's heritage as its docks. It's a resilient city that has bounced back from riots and recession by turning itself into a cultural capital and exploiting its rich rock history.
Liverpool was no great medieval town. There are no narrow streets and winding alleys with heavily timbered buildings, no ancient ruins here. In fact, when London, Bristol, York, Canterbury were thriving cities with populations in the thousands, Liverpool was still a muddy pool, a lifer pol in the ancient language. Even in Tudor times, the population was measured only in hundreds.
By the middle of the 19th century, that had all changed, and Liverpool had taken over from Bristol and become Britain's largest port. In medieval times, Liverpool was a provincial outpost. But once the Industrial Revolution had taken root in the north and trade routes had expanded to the west, it was perfectly placed to benefit from the trade of an empire on which the sun never set. Liverpool was at its most successful in Victorian and Edwardian times. Nearly all of its great buildings were built then. The most famous is the Liver Building, a 295-foot-high, 13-storey landmark construction. It opened in 1911 as the headquarters for the Royal Liver Friendly Society. The liver birds, a sort of cross between a cormorant and an eagle, are made of copper and stand 18 feet high.
Now, they were actually sculpted by a German sculptor called Karl Bernhard Bartels, who'd lived here for years, and 3 years after they went up, he was interned because the First World War broke out, and he was in prison for the whole war, and then they sent him home. Monstrous. There is a rumour that if the liver birds ever fly away, that'll be the end of Liverpool. Well, I reckon if they didn't move after Bartels was deported, they're not going to move now. And besides, if you look, they're all tied down.
This building's claim to fame doesn't just rest on the liver birds. It's England's first skyscraper.
And what's more, it's built of concrete, you can see. And that was really interesting. It was a first, because before then, concrete hadn't been used for such mega structures. Now, I'm just going to mix a little bit of concrete here. It wasn't new, the idea of concrete. There's a floor in Croatia that's 5,000 years old and made of concrete. And the Romans were very good at concrete too. I'm mixing up a little bit now, quite a sort of sloppy mixture, about 3 parts of sand to 1 part of cement, and then a bit of water in there, and then I just need to mix that up to a nice sort of slurry, And once that's sorted, I'm going to put that into this mould here. But the Romans and the Croatians before them didn't understand about reinforcing concrete. Imagine that that is a concrete beam and you want to put a load on the top. Concrete is very strong in compression, but it's very weak in tension. And if you load the beam there, there is tension underneath and the beam will crack there and break. But if you put reinforcing rods, steel rods through it, then they take up the tension. They give you tremendous tensile strength. So I've got one trough here with no reinforcing rods and one trough here with, you'll see, wire that I've shoved through near the bottom of the trough, so that when I load it from above, they will take up the tension. They will give you tensile strength. Now, it's going to take some time to set and make and all that, so I made some earlier, and this one has got no wires in it. This is not reinforced. And I'll just tip that out of its mould, and I'll put this carefully on the backs of these two chairs. And now what I'm going to do is bash it with my hand and see if I can break it. So, are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Absolutely no chance. Very weak in tension, so the bottom simply broke like that. You probably noticed if you watched it very carefully. Now let's try the reinforced one, and my prediction is that this won't break. And I've put it on the chairs, and I'll try and hit it with the same force as I hit the unreinforced one. 1, you ready? 2, 3. Ouch. Right, try again. 1, 2, 3. Right, both hands. 1, 2, 3. It won't go. It really won't go. I'll give it a bit more welly this time. Watch this carefully. There, now, I've cracked it. Look, there is a crack now. I've damaged it, but it still hasn't broken. It's made much, much stronger by having these wires taking the tensile strength underneath, and that is why reinforced concrete is so strong. Inside, the building is as grand and imposing as you might expect, giving the right impression of permanence and substance for an insurance company. But in fact, the Royal Liver Friendly Society were never going to occupy more than a couple of floors, and this wonderful atrium was let to the Canadian Pacific Steamship Line as a booking hall for their transatlantic voyages.
And this vast building captures something of Liverpool's contrasts. The Liver Friendly Society was established to provide decent burials for the working poor. This building's magnificence was paid for with the pennies of those afraid of a pauper's grave.
From 200 feet up here on the roof, you can see how enormous the clock is. That clock face is 25 feet across. That's bigger than Big Ben. In fact, there are only 3 other clocks as big as that in the whole country. One on the end, one on the other side, and one at the far end of the building.
At the top of the building, inside the clock room, you can really see how big they are.
Wow! It's huge.
Each clock has a separate mechanism, and they're all electric. Quite something for the early 1900s. The man who looks after the clocks and their chimes is John Waring.
John, you've got wonderful bells that chime the quarters and ring the hours, but I can't see the bells anywhere.
Well, the bells are here actually on these piano wires. They're not actual bells, but they're just...
Piano wires?
Piano wires,
Making all that noise?
Making all that noise, amplified through this machine here.
OK, show me. I don't believe you.
OK, well, I can't get it properly this time.
Can I do it? Can I have a go?
Yep. And these two at the end are the hourly ones which both hit together.
Together?
Yeah.
Can I try that?
Yeah.
Individual though it is, the Liver building has to take its place at the pierhead alongside two other monuments to Edwardian splendour, the Cunard building and the Mersey Docks and Harbour building, the Three Graces as they're lovingly known by the people of Liverpool. They represent the wealth of the city in its heyday, a wealth that came from international trade.
In Liverpool they built loads of docks and warehouses, most of them out of brick. This building behind me is the Stanley Dock Warehouse, and when it was built it was the biggest brick building in the world.
It took 21 million of them. The most famous of Liverpool's docks, opened in 1846, is the Albert Dock. 5 enormous warehouses facing 7.5 acres of enclosed water, 1 billion square feet of storage space. Its state-of-the-art arrangement was the work of Liverpool dock engineer Jesse Hartley. It was reckoned that the turnaround time for unloading and loading would be shortened by up to 2 weeks, and that meant increased profits. There was something else special about it too. It was the world's first fireproof dock. While it was on the drawing board, there were 2 great fires, one in warehouses in the town itself and the other in the German port of Hamburg, which raged there for days and destroyed much of the city. It was decided that no such thing would happen to the Albert Dock, and so it was built entirely of non-flammable materials: brick, tile, stone and iron, no wood at all. Liverpool's Maritime Museum is housed in one of the buildings.
A good deal of Liverpool's prosperity in the 1700s came from the slave trade, and quite a lot of this museum is devoted to the trade and the people who fought so hard to abolish it. But there were anti-abolitionists too. One of the better known was James Penny, who actually had a lane named after him, Penny Lane, which became much more famous than he was. He told a parliamentary committee that he'd actually invested in 11 voyages of slaves, each carrying 500 or 600 on board. And he said it was a humane trade, that the slaves on board slept more comfortably than gentlemen at home. Well, if that was true, I'm awfully glad I didn't spend the weekend with him, that's all I can say. Here is a very rare painting of a slave ship, and you'll see that there are 4 tiny little ports just above the black line, and those were the gratings through which the slaves were supposed to breathe air and keep cool. And imagine 500 or 600 people trying to get air through those holes. Well, no thanks, not for me.
Today, the Albert Dock is at the centre of Liverpool's rejuvenation. As well as the Maritime Museum, there's the Tate Gallery and a whole host of bars and restaurants, and the Beatles Story exhibition. Everywhere you go in this city there seems to be some connection or reference to the Fab Four and their contemporaries. Billy Fury, here by the Piermaster's house, and then there were the Mersey Beats, the Searchers and Cilla Black, and of course Jerry and the Pacemakers, who made the Mersey Ferry one of the most famous in the world. The ferry dates back to 1150 and was originally run by the monks from the priory at Birkenhead on the other side of the river. 750 years later, the demands of the 20th century made it obvious that something more was needed. In 1927, work began on an ambitious alternative, the world's longest road tunnel. In 1927, work began on the most ambitious tunnelling project the world had ever seen, a road tunnel under the Mersey. Digging began on both sides of the river, and in 1928, dignitaries met in the middle. It took another 6 years and the lives of 117 men before it was opened in 1934.
The tunnel was the biggest ever, with space for 4 lanes of traffic and room for a tramway underneath. Sadly, it was never installed. A second tunnel, the Kingsway, was opened by the Queen in 1971. I reckon it's only in Liverpool that the Queensway tunnel could be opened by the King and the Kingsway tunnel opened by the Queen.
If you count the approach roads, there are nearly 3 miles of tunnel here. but it seems a quite modest amount compared with the work of someone known as the Mole of Edge Hill.
This impressive facade is all that remains of the house of a rich man called Joseph Williamson. Well, all that remains above ground.
Joseph Williamson had made a fortune in the tobacco business and retired early. He moved to Edge Hill, a village on the southwest outskirts of Liverpool, in 1805. He promptly bought a large amount of the surrounding land and set about building houses. That was when his strange addiction to digging tunnels began. I'm going down to take a look at them. It's reckoned there must be up to 10 miles of tunnels leading away from here, all with no apparent purpose. Some say he was preparing for Armageddon, others that the tunnels led to his mistress's houses. Whatever the reason, they're beautifully built. Nobody knows how many tunnels there are or quite where they are. This map shows those that have been found, those that have shown up on seismic mapping, and those that are suspected to exist from other clues. Over the years, many have caved in or been blocked with rubble. They've been described as the world's largest underground folly.
One of the things I particularly like about these tunnels are the roofs. You see this lovely barrel arch, and it's surprising that it hasn't fallen down in 180 years or whatever it is. And they've made a wonderful model here to show how it works. So I've got a wooden former, and here's a bit of cement and a chunk of brick and another bit of cement and more brick, more cement, and these are just dropping in. The cement you can see is smooth, it's not sticky at all, and they're all just resting together, rather like the bricks overhead. This actually is very much the way Brunel built some of his bridges, particularly the Maidenhead Bridge. It was a very, very flat arch like this one, and everyone thought it would fall down as soon as he took the former out from underneath, and he deliberately left it there for weeks and weeks and weeks, and all his rivals were chortling and rubbing their hands, and when he took away the former, nothing happened, and it's still standing. So there we have the complete arch with bits of cement, and all those bits of wood are just resting there. Now, let's see if it's as good as Brunel's. Take away this piece of wood, take away the former holding it up. Look at that! Look at that! It stays up all by itself. And in fact, I can push it down. You can see it compresses a bit, and the force is being taken by these side pieces, but it doesn't collapse. And if I take a brick and put that on top, look at that! Ah, Les, you must be one of the friends of the tunnels, is that right?
Pleased to be,
yes. Do you come down here often?
When I can. When we're able to do a little bit of visiting with our members, we bring them down here.
Right. So this is Williamson's original cellar, is it?
We don't know really. We believe it is, but because the labyrinth is so large, we've just no idea where these can lead to or where they come from.
Why did he dig them?
Well, he gave work to soldiers coming back from the Napoleonic Wars. Rather than have them standing on street corners, hands in their pockets, he told them to dig, and he paid them for it. He spent £100,000 on these tunnels.
£100,000 in the early 1800s? Can we have a look?
Certainly can.
OK, you lead the way, because I don't know where we're going.
£100,000? In today's money, that'd be about 6 million.
It's quite narrow, isn't it, Les?
Further down we go, the more spacious it becomes.
Wow!
What a place.
Wow, that's huge. How long is this building, this room?
About 75, 80 foot long.
So all the walls are solid rock?
All solid rock, except for the shoulders where the springing has been put over.
Oh, and then you've got this lovely, lovely brick arch again. Wow.
Yeah.
Imagine what's down here.
Williamson's intentions seemed philanthropic, but the jobs he provided were rather dirty work. Another man who spent thousands of pounds of his own money on the well-being of others was keen on keeping people clean.
Liverpool's wealth came primarily from the docks, but there was industry too, like soap, for example. A chap called William Lever built a soap factory right on the banks of the Mersey. Now, before he came along, you had to buy your soap in the grocer. You'd go and buy your eggs and your butter and your flour, and then you'd ask for a chunk of soap, and the grocer would hack off a length off a great bar, and it was pretty rough stuff. But he did 3 things to improve the soap. First of all, he added pine kernel oil or copra to the soap, and this made it much softer and easier to lather, much nicer stuff altogether. Second, he gave it a name, Sunlight Soap, which implied brightness and cleanness. And third, he put it in a box. And now he had a product, and it sold like hotcakes, and he became very rich. He also became very famous, so famous in fact that a poem was written about him by a chap who is sometimes acknowledged to be the world's worst poet, William McGonagall. I have to read it to you. Listen to this. You can use it, the soap this is, you can use it with great pleasure and ease, he was a Scot, without wasting any elbow grease. And when washing the most dirty clothes, the sweat won't be dripping off your nose. You can wash your clothes with little scrubbing and without scarcely any rubbing. And I can tell you once without any joke, there's no soap can surpass Sunlight Soap. And believe me, charwomen one and all, I remain yours truly, the poet McGonagall.
In the 1890s, the factory was producing 180 million bars of soap a year and exporting it to America, Europe and throughout the empire. Lever built himself a modest house opposite his soap factory while his country mansion was being renovated. Then he built another 900 for his workers and called the village he'd created Port Sunlight. The most expensive rents were 10 shillings a week. That's only about £30 in today's money. It had an art gallery, a hospital and its own school, all provided by Lever. Most factory workers at this time would have lived in cramped and unsanitary terraced houses, but these houses were spacious and well equipped. One of the many buildings he provided was a girls' club. Today it houses the Port Sunlight Museum.
Inside is a replica of one of the cottages, and I'm sitting in the kitchen with Margaret Williams, who's the Port Sunlight historian. Margaret, what sort of equipment would they have had here in the kitchen?
Well, they would have had the range for cooking and heating water. To the rear of this room would have been a scullery.
Yes.
Where you would have a sink. Sometimes, as time went on, they would have maybe a gas cooker in there, a small one, and then a downstairs bathroom.
A bathroom with a bath.
Yes.
And hot water.
Hot water, yes. Lever believed that when a man came home from work, he should never enter the main living area where his wife and children were in a dirty state. So the first thing he expected a man to do was to come in through the back, bathe, change his clothes and then meet his family.
Oh, wonderful. Well, of course, I do that every day, except I try and avoid going out to work. But wonderful. This building, Hume Hall, was named after his wife's family. It was originally the dining hall for women. There was no fraternising at mealtimes. Now it's used for weddings, exhibitions, that sort of thing. And it was also the place where the Beatles, complete with Ringo, played for the first time.
I can't imagine what Viscount Leverhulme, as he became in 1922, would have made of the swinging 60s. He died in 1925 and is buried in the village church. And yes, he built this too, Christ Church. Religious rivalry has always been strong in Liverpool, and a century ago the city's Anglicans and Catholics competed to build the grandest cathedral. Financial problems dogged both sides. Eventually, though, 2 unique buildings were constructed. One was built by the designer of the telephone kiosk, and the other came to be known as Paddy's Wigwam.
In the 19th century, Liverpool had no cathedral, but the city was getting bigger and richer, and the pressure was on to build one. However, there was a huge Irish contingent in the population, and the question was, should it be Anglican or Catholic? Well, they didn't have any till the 20th century, and then they got two. The Anglican Cathedral, that big square tower there, and here, the Catholic Cathedral.
You might find it hard to believe, but this one was finished first, although it was a long time coming.
The first attempt at building a Catholic cathedral in Liverpool began in 1853, but it was never finished. And then 80 years later, they started on another one, and they laid the foundation stone just down there.
It is estimated that when the cathedral is finished, it will have cost about £3 million. The architect is the veteran Sir Edward Lutyens.
That one was never finished either. It would have been the biggest cathedral outside Rome, a staggering 520 feet tall. That's more than 100 feet taller than Salisbury, Britain's tallest. The crypt is the only part that was ever built. It's a simply magnificent space. It was finished soon after the end of the Second World War.
This is the roof of the crypt, and it's absolutely enormous. From that corner to that, I reckon it must be at least 100 yards. And yet, this is only about a third of the size that Lutyens originally planned. The trouble was that by the time they finished the crypt, there was only about £500,000 left in the kitty. And they reckoned that to finish the whole building would take £27 million. So what did they do? Well, in 1962 they began building this masterpiece, and they finished it in only 5 years.
Its most striking feature, and its crowning glory, is the 360-degree glass lantern. It was the work of the artists John Piper and Patrick Rentians. It's the largest commission of stained glass in the history of the church. The traditional way of colouring it is by adding oxides when it's being made. Copper for red, iron for green, cobalt for blue. I reckon there must be more than 100 tons of glass up there.
So this is an actual offcut from it, incredibly thick. Apparently it has to be this thick because it has to be set in concrete. Now the chap who makes this sort of stained glass is Ian Hart-Davis. You're a stained glass artist.
I am, yes.
And you work with this stuff all the time.
I do, yes.
This is something I know absolutely nothing about. Could I make a bit?
You certainly can.
What do I do?
First off, we need to draw a pattern onto the piece of paper.
So, this sort of thing?
That's fantastic, yes. You're doing a good job.
How about that?
That's great.
Right.
Okay. Then we have our glass cutter.
Yeah.
And we're going to get a piece of stained glass, place that on there. There, excellent.
Okay. So now I've got to go up this edge
Trim
here.
off the end there, yes.
Just up the edge of the paper.
The edge of the paper.
Right.
There we go.
And then along this bit.
Along the black line there, yes.
Going around the curves.
Around the curves. Excellent.
But now, hang on a sec. How do I get?
We need to pick it up and then we need to bend.
Bend. So this one here.
Bend your hands down. Yes, just pull down either side. Down.
Hey,
Snaps.
that's really
Excellent.
pleasing.
Excellent.
I can't do it. Oh, hey, it went. It's partly that I'm terrified of cutting myself. Don't you cut yourself all the time? But you don't cut your hands.
No.
Come on. Oh yes, lovely.
Excellent. Well, corner can make.
Thumb either side. Press down. God. Oh. Okay, so we build up the jigsaw again, and now.
Slowly.
Oh, it just bends round.
Bend on it.
Now, it's finished. And I can hardly believe it, but in principle, I ought to be able to pick it up and it won't fall apart. Look at that! Look! A real piece of stained glass. And I made it. Well, Well, with a lot of help from Ian, I have to say. But I'm really proud of that.
A few hundred yards away stands Britain's biggest cathedral and the largest Anglican cathedral in Europe. It has the world's biggest working church organ. Its foundation stone was laid in 1904. The architect chosen to design it was the 22-year-old Giles Gilbert Scott, the man that designed the red telephone box. His selection was controversial as he was a Catholic. It took decades to build, and it wasn't finished until 1978. The design was constantly changing. 2 towers became 1. In 1942, the architect presided over the setting of the last finial on the tower. This is the Lady Chapel. It was the first part to be built and was completed in 1910.
Then they built this.
The main part of the interior was finished in 1924. The northern end was completed in 1978, 18 years after its architect's death. It is truly awe-inspiring, with the highest and widest Gothic arches in the world.
And here in the choir stalls, there are some strange wooden carvings. Look at this beast. Pouting chest, great big wings at the back, bit of seaweed in its beak, and claws. It looks to me awfully like a liver bird. Paul McCartney came for an audition in the choir here, but he didn't get in. And then there are the bells. Just look at them. This is the highest and the heaviest peal of bells in the whole world. All the bells have names. One's called Gilbert, after the architect, and the huge one in the middle, you see behind this one here, right across, that's Great George, named after the King, George VI. It weighs 14.5 tons, and it was first rung at the hallowing of the bells on the 17th of November, 1951.
Each of the bells in the ring surrounding Great George is a different weight and size. The heaviest is Emmanuel, the tenor, at 8,200 hundredweight. That's as much as 4 cars. The smallest is Bede, the treble, a mere 900 hundredweight. 30 feet below the bells are the campanologists, or bell ringers to you and me.
It's fabulous up here near the bells, high up in the cathedral. And I'm with the ringing master. That is right, isn't it? You're not the ringmaster. You're not the bell captain. No, ringing master. Len Mitchell, yes. Now, tell me about Great George. All the other bells go all the way around, don't they? But Great George doesn't do that.
It doesn't indeed, no. That just is hung dead, it's hung static, and all you ring is the clapper inside and not the bell itself.
Right, but it still makes a decent noise.
A huge noise.
Right. And do you ring him every night? You call it it?
Well, it's Great George. It's named after. It's a he, I think. Probably.
Okay. So do you ring him every week?
No, it's just special occasions. I'm afraid we're limited ordinarily just to the Christmas Eucharist, the Festival Eucharist in July, and the Easter Eucharist. But we do get requests for other times of the year.
Well, this is another time of the year. Do you think?
It is indeed.
Do you think you could give him a tinkle?
I tell you what. Would you like to have a go?
Me?
Okay, what we do is you have to start it swinging gently to begin with.
Right.
Gradually increase until the clapper gets closer to the bell. And then when we get really close to the lip of the bell, we drop.
Oh, a big heave.
Absolutely huge.
Okay. And you're doing that every other time?
Stroke. That's about perfect timing.
Right.
So I reckon it must be time for you.
I'm very honoured for you to count this a special occasion. And I'd say thanks very much and shake your hand, but I seem to be stuck with this bell now. Ah! One more. Thank you very much indeed.
No problem. Well done.
That's wonderful.
Liverpool has its great civic buildings too, like St George's Hall. A very peculiar building. Inside you can hear a jailbird song at one end and great tenors at the other. At the heart of Liverpool's civic centre is St George's Hall.
It has been described as the finest neoclassical building in the world. Its sheer size is breathtaking. And as you might expect for Liverpool, there's something rather different about it.
It's a building that combines culture and criminality. Go in the north entrance and you find a magnificent concert and assembly hall.
Go in this entrance and you might end up in a cell, because there was here a criminal court with a courtroom just upstairs.
It's no longer in operation, although the cells are still here, complete with some rather dodgy characters. And so is this courtroom. It's still in use, but only as a film set.
A prisoner could stand here in the dock and never know there's a fabulous hall through the window just behind him.
The building was intended to house the city's triennial music festival. The foundation stone was laid in 1838. That was before the money to pay for it had been raised, and even before the building had been designed. At the same time, plans to build a new courthouse were underway. A competition was held to design each of the buildings, and it was won by the same man, Harvey Lonsdale Elms. When the concert people failed to raise the money for their building, the law people agreed to pay for the whole lot and combine court and concert hall.
Some aspects of Liverpool are amazingly posh. Look at this on the doors of St George's Hall, SPQL. Now this comes from the Latin SPQR, which was R for Rome. This is for Liverpool. It means Senatus Populusque Liverpolis, I guess, the Senate and people of Liverpool, as though they were the centre of the empire. And I'm told that in Victorian times the posh inhabitants weren't Liverpudlians, but Liverpolitans. There's something else rather special about this hall. It was the first building in the world to be air-conditioned.
Dr. Neil Sturrock is a ventilation historian, and he's been researching the system and its designer, David Boswell Reed. Reed had studied medicine and knew of the theory linking deadly diseases like cholera with poor living conditions, including air quality. His designs weren't just about providing comfort. His main aim was to improve health. Neil took me into the depths of the building where the great steam engine once stood, with huge fans to push the air around.
And where were these great fans?
There was one east, north, west and south.
Oh, I see.
Described north, south, east and west.
Okay.
Fanners.
And where did the cool air come in?
So the cool air came in through here, through a sort of thermal labyrinth, after it had been washed in two fountains. There were spray fountains. So the air was kind of washed and settled into that dust chamber, and then came through here into the centre, and primarily was sent north and south.
Wow, I begin to understand. You can't see this air conditioning system because we're in it.
We're inside it, yes.
This is where all the air would come. Is this cold air or hot air?
This could be hot air or cold air. This would be hot air in winter and cold air in summer.
I see. And what are all these doors? There are big rabbits in here.
The lower one would allow warm air to go up to the statue niches. All round the hall there are statues. Behind the niches there are 3 slots where the warm air came in. And the top one is connected to the grills in front of the statue niches, and that allowed air to recirculate. So this system allowed for the air to recirculate around the whole building. As far as I can work out, this would be where the main man would stand, the man who sent all the orders to everybody else.
So open flap 35 or whatever
Number
it is.
62, yes, and opened it this way.
But where's the machinery? I mean,
It was all done by hand.
All done by hand?
Yes.
What a wonderful system. Many thanks. That's brilliant.
You're very welcome.
Reed's system was never referred to as air conditioning, although today it's recognised as such. His groundbreaking designs were introduced in the Houses of Parliament and then in America, France and Russia. St George's took so long to build that in the end it wasn't the first purpose-built concert hall in the city at all. The Philharmonic was opened in 1849, 5 years before St George's opened its doors. Edward Elgar conducted the first performance of one of his Pomp and Circumstance marches in 1901. It was described as the best hall in Europe by Sir Thomas Beecham. It burnt down in 1933. Admirers of Art Deco won't be disappointed by its replacement. Although its main function is as a concert hall, don't forget in the 30s the cinema was all the thing.
Now, watch this. Take it away, Dave.
This is a Walter door screen. There are only 3 in existence. The one in St Petersburg is broken beyond repair. No one in Alexandria in Egypt can get theirs to work, leaving this as the only operational Walter door in the world. It weighs 7 tons and uses an antique counterweight system to rise to its full 19 feet. Fancy a drink or a bite after the film? Opposite are the Philharmonic dining rooms, locally known as the Philharmonic Pub or just the Phil.
These toilets are really something to behold. John Lennon used to come and drink at the Phil. In fact, he later complained that the price of fame was not being able to come to the Phil for a drink, and presumably for a pee.
When John was a regular here in the late 1950s, the Western world was about to experience a cultural revolution, and Liverpool was at the heart of it.
Liverpool, the Mersey sound. A sound that means something different from what it did when Liverpool was just an important port. Because now, much to its surprise, the great northern city has got a new industry, as incongruous as the soot on its classical buildings. The Mersey sound, yes, Liverpool selling pop music. Liverpool setting the fashion in Beatle hairdos that baffle you as to a person's gender. Liverpool kids are proud of the fact that their city is providing the world with beat music and an offbeat cult of fashion that has knocked their great docks as a municipal money spinner well into second place.
Liverpool's aspiring pop groups had something other British groups didn't. Access to the latest music from the United States brought over by American sailors. And there's one group that everybody's heard of.
The Beatles played here at the Cavern 274 times, and Cilla Black started her career here as a hat-check girl.
The Cavern wasn't actually the first place the Beatles played, although it is an essential stop-off on the Beatles' trail. The lives of the Fab Four are charted across the city and preserved for posterity. This semi-detached house in Menlove Avenue, where John Lennon grew up, is now listed by English Heritage. A former council house in Forth Lynn Road is listed too, Paul McCartney's childhood home. The back streets where George and Ringo lived have their visitors too. For those familiar with the Beatles' lyrics, there's plenty to be seen. The shelter in the middle of a roundabout. The barber who keeps photographs of all the heads he's known, and all beneath a cool suburban sky. Here at Wilton is where Paul first met John Lennon and the Quarrymen, who were playing at a church fete. And the latest addition to the pilgrim's route is the basement of a large suburban house in the West Derby area of Liverpool. It might seem an unlikely venue for the Beatles' first performance.
Round here at the back is the entrance to the basement, which is where the Casbah Coffee Club was. Oh, mind your head. This has been listed because it played such an important part in the Beatles' story.
The decoration was actually done by the Beatles when they were the resident band here in pre-Cavern days. Then, Pete Best was the Beatles' drummer. The house was his family home, and its basement was where the group called the Silver Beatles dropped the silver and became the most famous band the world has ever known.
It's wonderfully dark and cavernous down here, and I'm with Rory Best, who's the brother of Pete Best, who was one of the original Beatles. Tell me, Rory, did they really play down here for the first time?
They certainly did. They played in the other room first as the Quarrymen, then had a row with one of the members, and he left, and they asked Pete to join them. Pete joined them, and they went to Hamburg, and when they returned from Hamburg, they played just there. That's
Wow.
the Beatles.
Wow. And what were they like in the very beginning, when Pete was one of the band?
They were very average.
Do you mean rubbish?
Before Pete joined them, they were rubbish, yes.
And when they came back from Hamburg?
They were brilliant. They were absolutely brilliant. The long playing hours in Hamburg certainly made them. There's no doubt about that. They were playing 8 hours a night, 7 nights a week. And that was like a constant practice to them.
That's quite a gig, isn't it? 8 hours.
Absolutely.
Wow.
This is a city of contrasts. Cafes and cathedrals, semis and St George's, gravestones and graces.
Liverpool is an extraordinary city. Look at this waterfront. These extraordinary buildings, 100 years old, reaching for the sky, now being dwarfed by modern skyscrapers coming up like daffodils. And then from the modest back streets, an extraordinary upwelling of music.
Liverpool has had its ups and downs. It's still one of the more deprived areas in Britain, but there's a new spirit here, a new development everywhere. Liverpool's waterfront, like the Taj Mahal and the pyramids, has been designated by the United Nations as a World Heritage Site. Liverpool is regaining its former glory.
How Britain Was Built takes to Tyneside when the series continues in Newcastle at the same time next Great British Monday, only on History.